Harlem, New York, 10 o'clock a.m., February 21st, 1965. The New York sky today was not blue. It was a heavy leaden gray pressing down on the brown brick buildings of Harlem like the lid of a giant coffin slowly descending. The wind from the Hudson River blew in carrying the biting cold of February, seeping through the broken windows, whistling like the mournful cries of restless souls. Inside the discreet office above Mickey's bookstore on Lenox Avenue, the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and old paper. This was the throne of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the uncrowned Godfather of Harlem. But today the king looked much older than his actual age. Bumpy sat motionless before an ebony chessboard. He wasn't playing with anyone. He was playing with himself, a solitary habit of those in supreme power. On the chessboard, the Black King was surrounded on all sides by white pawns and aggressive knights. "He still refuses," Bumpy said, his voice deep and hoarse like the grinding of pebbles on the road. He didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the desperate chess position before him. Standing by the window, looking down at the bustling crowds on the street, was a man in his 30s. He wore a charcoal gray wool coat, its high collar obscuring part of his face. It was Julian. In the underworld, he was known as the Ghost. No one knew his real name. No one knew where he came from except Bumpy. 10 years ago, Julian was a former sniper returning from the Korean War, carrying with him bleeding psychological wounds and a heroin addiction that ravaged his body. Bumpy found him in a rubbish-strewn alley, dying from a drug overdose. Bumpy didn't kill him, nor did he abandon him. He took him in and helped him overcome his addiction and gave him a new purpose in life to become the shadow, the sword and shield of the mob boss. Malcolm said he didn't want the image of the civil rights movement tainted by the hands of gangsters. Julian replied, his voice cold and emotionless, but his eyes still scanned the cars parked on the street below, analyzing each potential danger. He believes God will protect him. He said, "If I die, it is Allah's will." Bumpy sneered. A bitter, sarcastic smile, the mockery of someone who had seen through the cruelty of life. "God?" Bumpy stood up and paced around the room. The sound of his leather shoes clicking on the wooden floor echoed steadily. "God's busy in Alabama. God's busy in Vietnam. Here in Harlem, God can't stop bullets, Julian. Only guns can stop guns." Bumpy paused before the map of New York hanging on the wall. Red pins marked the territories, the business routes. But today his mind wasn't on money or drugs. His mind was focused on one thing, the Audubon Auditorium. "You know Julian," Bumpy said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Malcolm and I, we walked two different paths. He chose the light, I chose the darkness. He used words, I used fists. But we are both sons of Harlem. If Malcolm dies this afternoon, no, I'm not talking about friendship. I'm talking about chaos. If he dies, the hope of black people in this country will be extinguished. We will be engulfed in riots. Blood will flow like a river on Lenox Avenue, and I'm too old to clean up that mess." Bumpy turned, looking directly into Julian's eyes. In the mob boss's gaze was no longer the command of a superior, but the plea of a father entrusting his most trusted son. He opened a desk drawer and took out an object. Not money, not gold. It was a crumpled entrance ticket printed with the words, "United African American Organization, Speaker Malcolm X, 2 o'clock p.m., February 21st, 1965. "You'll go there," Bumpy said, handing over the ticket. "Not as a public bodyguard. Malcolm sent all my men home. You have to go there like a ghost. Blend into the crowd. You're the last line of defense." Julian stepped forward, taking the ticket. He felt the weight of the thin paper. He knew this mission was unlike any he'd ever undertaken before. He wasn't ordered to kill a rival or collect a debt. He was ordered to protect a symbol. "What are the instructions, sir?" Julian asked, his hand unconsciously reaching for his shortened Colt .45 government model pistol hidden under his vest. "Am I allowed to eliminate the target if I detect a threat?" "No." Bumpy shook his head emphatically. His eyes became razor sharp. "This is the hardest part, Julian. You mustn't fire prematurely." Bumpy stepped closer, pressing his index finger against Julian's chest. "If you fire before they strike, you'll make Malcolm the instigator of violence. The white press will write that Malcolm's bodyguards opened fire on an innocent crowd. His career will be over. The movement will collapse." "So how long do I have to wait?" Julian asked, cold sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "You have to wait," Bumpy snarled. "You have to wait until death raises its scythe. You have to wait until the assassin's finger begins to pull the trigger. Only then, and only then, are you allowed to act." "It's a gamble, boss," Julian warned. "At close range, the line between life and death is 1,000th of a second. If I'm a beat too slow, Malcolm dies. If I'm a beat too fast, Malcolm loses all his honor." "I know." Bumpy turned back to the chessboard, picking up the Black Knight. The knight. The only piece that can leap over other pieces, attacking from unexpected angles. "But I believe you. You're my knight, Julian. Change history. Don't let the king fall." 2. The Road to Hell. 1:30 p.m. Julian stepped out of the bookstore, blending into the crowd on the street. He pulled his earthy brown fedora down low, tucking his neck into his worn coat to ward off the biting wind. He didn't drive. He walked. He wanted to feel the pulse of the city before the storm hit. Harlem was strange today. An invisible tension hung over every corner. There were more police patrol cars than usual, but they didn't stop. They just glided past like vultures waiting for a corpse. The FBI was certainly stationed everywhere. The National Islamic Organization, NOI, Malcolm's former brothers, now his sworn enemies, lurked in the shadows. Julian turned into a small alley to check his weapons one last time. He pulled out his Colt .45. The gun was dark cold and heavy. He had sharpened the barrel and adjusted the firing pin for maximum sensitivity. He removed the magazine and checked each bullet. 7. 7 chances, or 7 deaths. He tucked the gun back into the holster worn under his left armpit, close to his heart. He took a deep breath. The musty smell of the alley mingled with the smell of gasoline. "Be a ghost," Julian told himself. He relaxed his facial muscles, transforming the sharp eyes of a killer into the dull, weary gaze of an unemployed worker. He hunched his back slightly. Now he looked no different from the thousands of other nameless men in Harlem. 3. The Stage of Death. Audubon Auditorium. 2:15 p.m. Inside the Audubon Auditorium in Washington Heights, the stifling hot atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cold outside. About 400 people were there. Men, women, children. Their faces were dark and glistening with sweat, their eyes filled with both hope and anxiety. They had come to hear Malcolm X speak about the United African American Organization. They had come seeking a direction, but they didn't know they were walking into a shooting range. Julian handed his crumpled ticket to the ticket checker and walked through the security gate. No one searched him. Security was suspiciously lax. The New York police, usually present to harass people, were nowhere to be seen. Only a few of Malcolm's bodyguards stood scattered at the door, unarmed. A perfect trap, Julian thought to himself. They've cleared the way for the assassin. He didn't choose a seat in the back rows. He needed a good view, but he couldn't sit too close and risk being spotted. Julian chose a seat in the 4th row, slightly to the right of the stage. This position allowed him to observe the entire front row, the most dangerous spot, and offered a perfect angle for shooting diagonally across the stage. He sat down, pulled his hat down to cover half his face, pretending to be dozing off while waiting. But beneath the brim, his eyes were working at full capacity. He scanned every face in the audience. He ignored the women fanning themselves with program sheets. He ignored the old men coughing. He was searching for the smell of an assassin. The smell of tension, of suppressed adrenaline, of deadly concentration. And he found it. In the first row directly in front of the stage, 3 men sat apart from the crowd. The one in the middle was Talmadge Hayer. Julian recognized him from the photos Bumpy's intelligence network had provided. Hayer had a sharp face, fanatical eyes. He wore a thick, long coat despite the room being very hot. His hands were always tucked deep into his jacket pockets. The other 2 sat on either side of Hayer Norman, 3X Butler, and Thomas, 15X Johnson. They were large and sullen. They didn't speak to each other, nor did they look around. Their eyes were fixed on the empty wooden platform on the stage. Julian felt a jolt run down his spine. They were here. He gently slipped his right hand under his jacket, releasing the safety catch of his gun. His thumb lightly traced the rough wooden stock. 4. The moment before the storm. 2:30 p.m. The noise in the auditorium suddenly subsided as a tall, thin man wearing horn-rimmed glasses stepped onto the stage. Malcolm X. He wore a stylish black suit and a thin tie. But Julian noticed the difference. Malcolm's steps were no longer as graceful as usual. His shoulders were slightly slumped. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark with sleep and anxiety. He looked more like a condemned man walking to the execution platform than a leader. The applause thundered. Shouts rang out. "Malcolm, Malcolm!" Malcolm smiled and waved. His smile held a hint of sadness, yet was also full of compassion. "Assalamu alaikum." "Peace be with you," Malcolm said, his voice still resonant and powerful. "Wa alaikum assalam." "And peace be with you," the crowd responded in unison. Julian didn't applaud. His entire body tensed like a taut string. He saw Hayer in the front row nod slightly to the two men beside him. Hayer's hand in his jacket pocket moved. At the back of the auditorium, about 6 rows from where Julian sat, a sudden shout rang out. "Get your hands out of my pockets, you black bastard!" It was the signal. A man jumped to his feet, arguing with the man next to him. The crowd turned to look, murmuring. Attention was diverted. "Calm down, guys. Don't be rash." Malcolm on the stage raised his hand, trying to calm the crowd. He left the platform, stepping forward to get a better look at the brawl. It was a fatal mistake. He had stepped out of his only cover. Malcolm's bodyguards abandoned their positions backstage to run to the back of the auditorium to stop the staged fight. The stage was now completely empty. Malcolm stood alone, exposed to the muzzles of the guns. Julian saw it all. Time seemed to slow down in his eyes. He saw dust particles floating in the stage lights. He saw beads of sweat rolling down Malcolm's forehead. And he saw the 3 men in the front row jump up. Talmadge Hayer pulled a large dark object from under his long coat. Not a pistol. It was a shotgun. A weapon capable of devastating area of effect damage at close range. The other 2 pulled out Luger P08 semi-automatic pistols. 3 barrels pointed directly at Malcolm X's chest. The distance was less than 4 meters. At this range, the shotgun would tear Malcolm to shreds. In that frozen moment, Julian knew he couldn't shoot all 3 at once. If he shot Hayer in the head, Hayer's finger would still reflexively pull the trigger. If he shot the other 2, Hayer would still shoot. He needed an impossible shot. A shot to stop the Grim Reaper's scythe. Julian sprang to his feet amidst the crowd turned their backs to the stage. He didn't scream. Screaming would be useless. He raised his Colt .45. He didn't aim at the assassin's head. He didn't aim for his heart. The eyes of the former sniper locked onto a tiny point, the metal bolt of the shotgun in Hayer's hand. He took a very quiet breath, and as Talmadge Hayer's finger began to tighten around the shotgun's trigger, Julian pulled the trigger. Audubon Auditorium, 3:10 p.m. In the world of sharpshooters, time doesn't flow in a straight line. It stretches, condenses, then shatters. When Julian pulled the trigger, the world around him vanished. The screams, the brawl at the back of the room, the whirring of the ventilation fan. All fell silent. Only the pounding of his heart and the magnified image of the shotgun in Talmadge Hayer's hand remained. Hayer's fingers began to curl. The spring mechanism inside the short-barreled shotgun started to engage. The firing pin hurtled toward the primer of the .12 gauge shotgun pellet. That's when Julian's Colt .45 burst fire. Bang! No silencer could mask this deafening sound in the confined space. The hollow point bullet ripped through the air, traversing 10 meters in an instant. It whizzed past the shoulder of a woman who was standing up screaming, tearing a small gash in her sleeve before hurtling straight to its target. Fate had been sealed. Julian's bullet struck the metal receiver of the shotgun at the exact moment Hayer pulled the trigger. Clang! The deafening sound of metal against metal echoed like a sledgehammer striking an anvil. The immense kinetic energy of the .45 bullet flung the shotgun barrel 30 degrees to the left. And then, boom! Hayer had pulled the trigger. The shotgun fired. But instead of the barrage of lead shrapnel tearing through Malcolm X's chest, the terrifying blast of fire landed squarely on the oak podium beside him. Wood fragments flew like fireworks. A hole the size of a soup bowl appeared in the podium. The force of the explosion so close to the target, coupled with the sheer surprise, sent Malcolm X tumbling backward. His horn-rimmed glasses flew off his face, sliding across the wooden stage floor. The entire Audubon Auditorium fell silent. The silence lasted a single heartbeat. Everyone stared in stunned silence at the blue smoke rising from Hayer's gun and from the hole in the wooden platform. They didn't understand what had just happened. They only saw Malcolm fall. "They killed Malcolm," a woman shrieked, shattering the stillness. Chaos erupted. Talmadge Hayer stared at his gun. The metal was dented, the barrel smoking. He couldn't understand why he had missed from 3 meters away. He turned to his 2 accomplices, Butler and Johnson. Shoot him again!" Hayer yelled. The other 2, armed with Luger pistols, were about to storm the stage to finish off Malcolm, who lay on the floor. But Julian was no longer there. The moment the first bullet left the barrel, the ghost materialized. He stomped on his chair, leaping into the air, jumping over the terrified audience. He landed in the aisle, assuming a firm stance. Julian wasn't a cold-blooded killer who enjoyed indiscriminate murder. He was a protector. His mission was to neutralize the threat, not to commit a massacre. He raised his gun, his eyes wide, coldly locked onto his target. Bang! The second bullet struck Norman Butler's right bicep, the man who had raised his Luger to shoot Malcolm. The shot was so accurate it severed a tendon, sending the gun flying 3 meters away. Butler fell backward, clutching his arm and screaming in pain. Thomas Johnson, the remaining assassin, spun his gun around, aiming it at Julian. But he was a beat slower than Julian. Bang! Julian's third bullet pierced Johnson's left shoulder. The force of the .45 round sent him spinning before collapsing onto the front row of seats. 3 assassins were downed in less than 5 seconds. Talmadge Hayer, the only one unhit, frantically pulled a spare pistol from his belt. He intended to return fire at Julian. Julian didn't fire. He lunged forward, delivering a front kick to Hayer's chest. Be in. The sound of breaking ribs echoed. Hayer flew backward, his back hitting the edge of the stage, and lay motionless, blood gushing from his mouth. Julian stood tall amidst the 3 writhing assassins. He gasped for breath, his Colt still pointed forward, a thin mist of gunpowder smoke enveloping him. On stage, Malcolm X scrambled to his feet. He fumbled for his glasses and put them on. His face was pale, his vest stained with wood dust. He looked down at the hole in the podium, where his heart should have been. Then he looked down at the 3 men groaning on the floor. And finally his gaze settled on the stranger standing between him and death. Julian turned. For the first and only time, the eyes of the Phantom and the Black Prince met. In Malcolm's eyes was shocked disbelief and profound gratitude. In Julian's eyes there was only coldness and urgency. Go! Julian shouted, his voice hoarse but authoritative, drowning out the chaotic noise. Backstage immediately. There are others. At this moment, Malcolm's bodyguards, who had just been tricked into going to the back of the room, finally recovered from their shock and rushed forward. They saw the horrific scene and immediately understood what was happening. They stormed onto the stage, shielding Malcolm with their bodies and escorting him behind the velvet curtain. Catch them, kill the murderers. The crowd, after the initial shock, began to descend into a frenzied rage. They charged towards the 3 injured assassins. Punches and kicks rained down like a storm. They wanted to tear apart those who dared to assassinate their hope. This chaos was Julian's only chance to escape. Police sirens blared from Broadway. Julian knew he only had about 60 seconds before the police sealed off the building. If caught, he would be in serious trouble. He was a convicted criminal, a contraband carrier, and had just shot 3 people. Even though it was to save Malcolm in the eyes of the white police officers, a black man with a gun was still just a criminal. He quickly hid the Colt in his jacket, pulling his collar up. He didn't chase Malcolm backstage. That was a dead end. He turned around, heading towards the main door. The crowd was in a panic. Some running out, others trying to push their way through to see, creating a chaotic flow. Julian moved like a fish swimming against the current. He used the crowd-moving technique Bumpy had taught him, not using brute force, using agility. He slipped past one person's shoulder, slid past another's hip. Get out of the way. There's a gun! There's a gun! Julian pretended to shout, creating panic to make people move aside, clearing a path for him. He glided past a woman sobbing with her child. He glided past an old man kneeling in prayer. No one could clearly see his face. In their eyes, he was just another man running away in fear. When Julian reached the main hall, he saw the first 2 police officers running up the stairs, batons in hand. Julian calmly turned to the side exit leading down the alley behind the building. He pushed open the door and stepped outside. The cold February wind lashed his face, chilling but bringing a sense of freedom. Julian leaned against the cold brick wall, taking a deep breath to calm his pounding heart. His hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline. He looked down at his hands. These hands had just changed history. Malcolm X was still alive. A sleek, jet-black Cadillac Fleetwood slowly rolled into the alley. The rear window was half down. Inside the car, Bumpy Johnson sat silently holding an old newspaper, but his eyes were fixed on the emergency exit. Julian opened the car door and climbed into the back seat. The warmth from the car's heater enveloped him, a stark contrast to the cold outside. The car immediately sped off, merging into the bustling New York City streets, leaving behind the chaotic Audubon Auditorium with its flashing red and green lights and blaring sirens. "Are you done?" Bumpy asked, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. "Yes, boss," Julian replied, taking off his fedora and wiping the sweat from his forehead. "He's alive, not a scratch. And the other three, severely injured, but alive. The crowd is taking care of them before the police arrive. They won't be able to escape. Hayer will have to confess everything." Bumpy nodded slightly. A rare, subtle smile appeared on the mob boss's lips. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a cigar, but didn't light it. He just twirled it in his hand. "You know, Julian," Bumpy said, his voice low and pensive, "tonight, the whole of America won't sleep. The FBI will go crazy. Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Islamic State, will tremble, because Malcolm X is now immortal." "He saw me, boss," Julian said, his voice anxious. "His eyes. He knew I wasn't just any ordinary bodyguard." "Of course he knew," Bumpy sneered. "Malcolm is a wily old fox, but he's also a man of honor. He wouldn't betray his benefactor." The car turned onto Lenox Avenue, heading toward downtown Harlem. In the distance, the sun was beginning to set, but the gray clouds seemed to be dissipating, giving way to a last glimmer of red light. Julian looked out the window. He saw the newspaper vendors running down the street, shouting out the same old morning news, completely unaware that their world had just been turned upside down. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, Malcolm X would not be a fallen soldier in a coffin. He would be a warrior returned from the dead, and his words would carry immense weight. "Let's go home," Bumpy said. "We have a game of chess to play, and this time the Black King has a new move." Julian closed his eyes, resting his head against the comfortable car seat. He was exhausted, but a strange sense of peace crept into him. He remembered the moment the bullet struck the gun, that deafening clang. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the bell heralding a new era. New York, 7:00 p.m., February 21st, 1965. Night fell over New York, bringing no peace. On the contrary, it was like a boiling cauldron. At the New York Times, typewriters were working at full capacity, the sound of keys clattering like hailstones. Editors were shouting, telephones ringing incessantly. They were tearing up the already printed front page to replace it with a shocking headline: "Malcolm X miraculously escapes death. Mystery gunman takes down killer." On Wynn's radio, the announcer's voice was hurried and filled with panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, police confirm that the 3 suspects arrested at the Audubon Auditorium are members of the Islamic National Movement. Talmadge Hayer, the ringleader, has broken ribs and is receiving emergency treatment at Bellevue Hospital under tight security. However, the biggest question remains unanswered. Who is the 4th man? Who is the mysterious savior who shot down the assassin's weapon with an unbelievable shot and then vanished into thin air?" At FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was even gloomier than a funeral. Director J. Edgar Hoover sat in his office, gripping the telephone receiver so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His plan of turning a blind eye to a murder had failed miserably. Malcolm X was not dead. Worse, he was now a living martyr. "Find that guy," Hoover hissed through clenched teeth. "Find the one who fired that shot. He's not an amateur. He's a national security threat." But Hoover didn't know that the man he was looking for was sitting in a safe apartment in the heart of Harlem, protected by a force even the FBI feared. Bumpy Johnson's safe apartment, Sugar Hill area, 8:30 p.m. Julian sat on a worn velvet sofa, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes fixed on the news on the black and white television. He had changed out of his old worker's clothes, washed away the smell of gunpowder and sweat. Now he looked more like an unemployed jazz musician than a killer who had just changed history. Bumpy Johnson stood by the window, looking down at the yellowish streetlights. He had just hung up the phone after a series of calls directing his henchmen to create a smokescreen to mislead the police. "You've become the most famous person in America, son," Bumpy said without turning around. "The police are offering a $10,000 reward for information on you. The FBI is definitely scouring the military records of all the black former snipers." "Are you worried, boss?" Julian asked, his voice calm. "Of course." Bumpy turned his aged face, relaxing slightly. "But I'm more worried about them. If they come to Harlem looking for you, they'll get lost in a maze." Bumpy stepped forward and poured Julian more wine. "Talmadge Hayer is confessing," Bumpy said. "He's a coward. When cornered, he'll bite his boss. He confessed that the order to kill Malcolm came from the highest levels of the Islamic State. Elijah Muhammad won't sleep well tonight." "And Malcolm?" Julian asked the question that concerned him most. "How is he?" "He's at his sister's house in Queens. His wife and children are safe. The doctors say he only suffered minor abrasions and a bit of trauma, but—" Bumpy paused, his gaze becoming distant. "Near-death experiences often change people. Either they make them recoil in fear, or they turn them to stone." "Which kind do you think Malcolm will be?" Bumpy smiled mysteriously. "Malcolm is a phoenix, Julian. He needs fire to be reborn. And this afternoon, you ignited that fire for him." A secluded house in Queens, 9:00 p.m. Malcolm X sat in the dimly lit living room, illuminated only by the light from the street lamp filtering through the curtains. His wife, Betty Shabazz, was rocking their young daughters to sleep in the inner room. Malcolm was still wearing the white shirt stained with wood dust from the explosion this afternoon. He took off his glasses and rubbed his nose. The sound of gunfire still echoed in his head. Clang! That sound kept repeating in his head. The bullet hitting the shotgun. An unbelievable shot. Malcolm was an intelligent man. He had lived a life on the streets under the nickname Detroit Red before finding the light of religion. He knew about guns. He knew that at that distance, in a chaotic crowd, hitting the bolt of a moving gun, that wasn't luck. It was supreme skill. And more importantly, that man had looked at him. A cold, but not hostile gaze. A protective gaze. He had yelled at him to run. He had covered his retreat. "Not an angel," Malcolm muttered. "Angels don't use Colt .45s. It's a demon. But whose demon?" In his mind, he pictured an old man always sitting alone in a bookstore in Harlem playing chess. The man whose help he had once refused out of pride and moral integrity. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Malcolm stood up. He felt a surge of new strength run through his body. The fear of death had vanished. When you look death straight in the eyes and death blinks first, you have nothing to fear. He walked to the desk phone. His fingers hesitated for a moment, then decisively dialed the number. It was a number not in the address book. A number he had memorized long ago, but swore he would never call. Bumpy Johnson's office. The phone rang, shattering the silence of the room. Bumpy and Julian looked at each other. Neither spoke, but both knew who was calling. Only a few people knew this number at this hour. Bumpy picked up the phone. "Hello." Silence on the other end. Only heavy breathing. The breathing of someone who had just returned from the brink of death. "Ellsworth," the voice rang out. Warm, powerful, familiar, yet with a hint of metallic sharpness. "It's me." Bumpy leaned back in his chair, an unlit cigar in his hand. "Hello, Malcolm. I hear you have a speech this afternoon, a spectacular one." "Don't beat around the bush, Ellsworth," Malcolm said, his voice sharp. "The man in the fourth row, the one in the brown coat, the one who shot down the shotgun. He's one of your men." It wasn't a question. It was an assertion. Bumpy was silent for a moment. He knew lying now would be pointless and disrespectful to Malcolm's intellect. "I don't know who you're talking about." Bumpy replied, his voice softer. "But if such a man exists, he must have seen something worth protecting." "Why?" Malcolm asked, his voice faltering. The toughness began to crack, revealing the emotion of a human being. "I rejected you. I called people like you the cancer of society. I turned my back on your world. Why did you still save me?" Bumpy looked at Julian, who sat with his head bowed, swirling his glass of wine. "Because, Malcolm," Bumpy said slowly, each word etched into stone. "You are the loudspeaker. I am the street. The loudspeaker needs the street to reach its target, and the street needs the loudspeaker to speak its pain." Bumpy paused, letting his words sink into the other end of the line. "You think you fight with words, and I fight with guns? No. We are both fighting for the same thing. Respect. You want white people to respect us through the law. I force them to respect us through fear. Two paths, but the same destination." Silence on the other end of the line. Malcolm was struggling intensely internally. His ideal of moral purity was clashing with a harsh reality that sometimes to do good, one needed the hand of the devil. Malcolm hesitated. "I was wrong, Ellsworth. I thought I could go alone. But this afternoon I realized that a king without soldiers is just a moving target." "You owe me nothing," Bumpy said, quickly cutting short the sentimental thank you. "But Malcolm, the world changed after this afternoon's shot. You are no longer a preacher, you are a survivor. And survivors are far more dangerous than martyrs." "What do you want me to do?" "Do what you do best," Bumpy said. "Speak, shout. Name the men who want to kill you. Don't be afraid anymore, because from now on, my shadow will cover your light." Malcolm took a deep breath. "Okay, I understand. And Ellsworth, please send my thanks to that invisible friend." "He heard it," Bumpy said, smiling at Julian. The call ended. Morning of February 22nd, 1965. Malcolm X held a press conference. Unlike the press's predictions that he would retreat into seclusion after the failed assassination attempt, Malcolm appeared stronger than ever. He no longer looked the fatigue of the previous day. Standing before a forest of microphones, Malcolm looked directly into the cameras. "Yesterday they tried to kill me," Malcolm said, his voice booming. "They used guns to silence the truth, but they failed. And their failure is proof that the age of fear is over." He held up a newspaper with a picture of Talmadge Hayer's capture. "I know who's behind this, and I'm telling you, I won't stop. I'm going to take this to the United Nations. I'm going to join forces with Martin Luther King. I'm going to join forces with all those who love freedom. We won't just use words. We're going to use our legitimate right to self-defense." The press room buzzed. A new version of Malcolm X had emerged, sharper, more pragmatic, and more dangerous to racists. In a corner of the press conference room, Julian leaned against the wall, his baseball cap covering his face. He looked at Malcolm on the platform, then nodded slightly. Bumpy was right. The Black King was still standing on the chessboard, and now it was beginning to counterattack. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson folded his newspaper. He looked out the window where the first snowflakes of the winter storm began to fall. "The game has just begun," Bumpy murmured. "Now let's see how the FBI handles this blow." The alliance between the Saint and the Godfather was forged in the shadows. An alliance without written words, without oaths, but stronger than anything, an alliance of blood and life. However, Bumpy knew that Julian's actions not only saved Malcolm, they had angered America's darkest forces, and they wouldn't stand idly by. Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968. 3 years had passed since the shooting at Audubon Auditorium. In those 3 years, America had changed faster than 3 centuries combined. Malcolm X's survival had created a massive butterfly effect. He didn't retreat, but advanced even more powerfully. Most importantly, he found common ground with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One side represented the pragmatic black power, the other the humane nonviolence. They were 2 arms of the same giant body, tightening their grip on the throat of racial segregation. At the Lorraine Motel, the April afternoon air was stifling and tense. Martin Luther King had just stepped out onto the second-floor balcony, breathing in the fresh air before dinner. But in this timeline, he was not alone. Standing beside him, tall and wearing horn-rimmed glasses, was Malcolm X. "Martin," Malcolm said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the buildings across the street. "You shouldn't stand here too long. Bumpy warned me. The hacking network from Chicago reports that a white guy named James Earl Ray is lurking around here." Martin smiled a gentle smile. "My friend, we can't live in fear forever. If God wants me to go home, I will." "God may want that," Malcolm adjusted his collar, "but I won't, and neither will our friend." In the apartment building across the street in the second-floor shared bathroom, James Earl Ray was aiming his Remington .760 Game Master through the window. He had locked on to Martin Luther King. Perfect range. History was about to repeat a tragedy. He held his breath, his fingers slowly tightening on the trigger. But he didn't know that on the roof of the Lorraine Motel, crouching behind the chimney, was Julian, the ghost. Julian was now older, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were still razor-sharp. He no longer used a handgun. In his hands was a specialized M40 sniper rifle. Julian didn't wait for the gunshot like before. He wouldn't risk Martin's life as Bumpy had risked Malcolm's. The moment James Earl Ray poked his gun out of the bathroom window, Julian saw the reflection of the scope. Bang! A dry, sharp bang echoed from the roof of the Lorraine Motel. Julian's bullet pierced the bathroom window, striking James Earl Ray's right shoulder just before he could fire. Ray screamed in pain, his rifle falling to the floor. He collapsed, blood gushing out. He tried to crawl to the door, but the Memphis police, who had been tipped off anonymously beforehand, kicked it open and stormed in. On the balcony, Malcolm X immediately pinned Martin Luther King to the floor. "Lie down, Martin." They lay there, their hearts pounding, listening to the blaring sirens. Martin looked up at the roof opposite. He saw no one. Only a dark figure darted and disappeared into the sunset. "It's him again," Martin whispered. "Yes," Malcolm nodded, helping Martin up. "Our guardian angel, an angel with a gun." Harlem, New York, July 1968. The summer in Harlem was scorching hot. But in the Wells restaurant where Bumpy Johnson usually had breakfast, the air conditioning hummed pleasantly. Bumpy sat at his usual table. He looked very weak. The terrible heart disease was gnawing away at the old leader's final days. His face was ashen, his hands trembling as he held the coffee cup. Julian sat opposite him. He had returned safely from Memphis. He was no longer a bodyguard. He resembled a son sitting with his elderly father. "Look at this, boss." Julian pointed to the television on the wall. The news broadcast showed a historic image: President Lyndon B. Johnson signing the expanded Fair Housing Act with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X beside him. The two men of color shook hands, their smiles radiant. America was not consumed by the riots following King's death because he was still alive. Instead, it was entering an era of reconciliation. Bumpy watched the image, his dull eyes suddenly brightening with a last glimmer of light. "Beautiful," Bumpy whispered, placing his hand on his aching left chest. "The game is complete. The king and the bishop are safe. You've won this game, boss," Julian said, his voice choked with emotion. "The whole world owes you." "Nobody owes me," Bumpy shook his head weakly. "I'm a gangster, Julian. I sell poison to my own people. I kill without hesitation. I'm going to hell." Bumpy took a hard breath, then continued. "But at least, when I'm down there, I can tell the devil I kept the angels alive." A heart attack struck like a 1,000-pound punch. Bumpy collapsed onto the table. The coffee spilled all over the pristine white tablecloth. Boss!" Julian rushed forward, supporting the Godfather. But it was too late. Bumpy Johnson, the uncrowned king of Harlem, the most dangerous man and also the most silent protector, had breathed his last. He didn't die from an enemy bullet. He died because his heart had completed its mission. Woodlawn Cemetery. 3 days later. Harlem had never witnessed such a strange funeral. Thousands of people poured into the streets. Notorious gangsters wept alongside gentle housewives. Drug lords bowed their heads beside pastors. Bumpy Johnson was a complex figure. He was both a terror and a benefactor to this neighborhood. As the casket was lowered into the grave, the crowd parted. A sleek black Lincoln pulled up. 2 men stepped out. The entire cemetery fell silent. No one could believe their eyes. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. They had no bodyguards. They walked slowly to the grave. Martin clasped his hands in prayer while Malcolm stood solemnly, his eyes red behind his glasses. They said nothing. Their presence here was a more shocking statement than any speech. It confirmed the rumors circulating in the underworld for years that Bumpy Johnson was not just a criminal. Malcolm X stepped forward, placing a small object on the coffin lid. It was a chess piece, the Black Knight. He whispered just loud enough for Julian, who stood silently by the old oak tree, to hear. "Rest in peace, old friend. Thank you for walking in the shadows so we could step into the light." The 2 leaders bowed one last time, then turned and walked away. 1990. Julian the Ghost was now a 60-year-old man. He lived in seclusion in a peaceful suburb, running a small watch repair shop. One winter afternoon, a young reporter came to him. She was writing a book about the history of the civil rights movement and its unsolved mysteries. Mr. Julian, the reporter asked, turning on her tape recorder. There are rumors that he worked for Bumpy Johnson. Rumors that he was at the Audubon Auditorium in 1965 and in Memphis in 1968. That he was the one who changed everything. Is that true? Julian stopped adjusting the pendulum clock. He looked out the window where the snow was falling heavily. He remembered the smell of gunpowder from that year. He remembered the sharp clang of metal as the bullet struck the barrel. He remembered Bumpy's final smile at Wells. Julian smiled a mysterious smile. "My dear," Julian said, his voice low and warm. "History is written by the victors in the sunlight, but sometimes the most important lines are written by those in the shadows." He picked up the clock, listening to its steady ticking. "I'm just a watchmaker. But I know one thing: time is the most precious thing. And sometimes, to buy more time for good people, someone has to accept being the bad guy." Julian never admitted it. But in the history book of this real world, the world where Malcolm X and Martin Luther King grew old together, the names of Bumpy Johnson and Julian are not written in gold ink. They are written in blanks. Blanks where funerals should have been now filled with speeches of freedom. And the sound of that bullet, the close-range explosion, was not the sound of violence. It was the sound of a bell signaling that destiny is not something predetermined. It is something that can be broken by the will of a man who dares to pull the trigger for what is right.
Woodlawn Cemetery. 3 days later. Harlem had never witnessed such a strange funeral. Thousands of people poured into the streets. Notorious gangsters wept alongside gentle housewives. Drug lords bowed their heads beside pastors. Bumpy Johnson was a complex figure. He was both a terror and a benefactor to this neighborhood. As the casket was lowered into the grave, the crowd parted. A sleek black Lincoln pulled up. 2 men stepped out. The entire cemetery fell silent. No one could believe their eyes. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. They had no bodyguards. They walked slowly to the grave. Martin clasped his hands in prayer while Malcolm stood solemnly, his eyes red behind his glasses. They said nothing. Their presence here was a more shocking statement than any speech. It confirmed the rumors circulating in the underworld for years that Bumpy Johnson was not just a criminal. Malcolm X stepped forward, placing a small object on the coffin lid. It was a chess piece, the Black Knight. He whispered just loud enough for Julian, who stood silently by the old oak tree, to hear. "Rest in peace, old friend. Thank you for walking in the shadows so we could step into the light." The 2 leaders bowed one last time, then turned and walked away. 1990. Julian the Ghost was now a 60-year-old man. He lived in seclusion in a peaceful suburb running a small watch repair shop. One winter afternoon, a young reporter came to him. She was writing a book about the history of the civil rights movement and its unsolved mysteries. "Mr. Julian," the reporter asked, turning on her tape recorder, "there are rumors that he worked for Bumpy Johnson. Rumors that he was at the Audubon Auditorium in 1965 and in Memphis in 1968. That he was the one who changed everything. Is that true?" Julian stopped adjusting the pendulum clock. He looked out the window where the snow was falling heavily. He remembered the smell of gunpowder from that year. He remembered the sharp clang of metal as the bullet struck the barrel. He remembered Bumpy's final smile at Wells. Julian smiled a mysterious smile. "My dear," Julian said, his voice low and warm. "History is written by the victors in the sunlight, but sometimes the most important lines are written by those in the shadows." He picked up the clock, listening to its steady ticking. "I'm just a watchmaker. But I know one thing: time is the most precious thing, and sometimes to buy more time for good people, someone has to accept being the bad guy." Julian never admitted it. But in the history book of this real world, the world where Malcolm X and Martin Luther King grew old together, the names of Bumpy Johnson and Julian are not written in gold ink. They are written in blanks. Blanks where funerals should have been now filled with speeches of freedom. And the sound of that bullet, the close-range explosion, was not the sound of violence. It was the sound of a bell signaling that destiny is not something predetermined. It is something that can be broken by the will of a man who dares to pull the trigger for what is right.